Hello everyone. Welcome. Happy New Year. It is a snowy, icy day in Toronto. Toronto is all about ice. And today we had snow last night and it's melting, so it's now turning to ice. Hello Kathy. Hello Elise. Hello Donna. Hello Kathleen. Hello Helen. Oh, from the UK, you've stayed up. Oh, actually, what time is it in the UK? I guess it's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon in the UK. Pam and Donna, welcome everyone. I hope you've had a happy new year. It's almost been very therapeutic saying goodbye to 2020. I was talking with a friend in Scotland as the new year was approaching, and I was just so happy when he crossed midnight and I knew 2021 was actually coming. It just felt like I had to be on tenterhooks because who knew that there might be an earthquake somewhere or some other terrible disaster just to add to the toll of 2020. Now, I realize now that 2021 is still very similar to 2020. We still have to isolate. We still have to be careful until we get in line for the vaccine. But I feel more hopeful this year than I did last year. Oh, wow. We've got Trudy from South Africa and Maya from Finland. And Paula and Sue and Leanne. Welcome everyone. Gloria from Springfield, Massachusetts. Julie from Pennsylvania. My last Q&A in December, I was very focused. I had a list of questions to answer. I had a lot of prep done. And in the background, I was also worried about my daughter who had COVID. And luckily, she did not have a terrible case. Her boyfriend had it much worse. But people thought that it was less organic than it normally is. So I've decided this time I'm going to just answer questions that come in the feed. I got a couple ahead of time in the little notes here. But please ask the questions and we'll go from the list today. Hi, Elaine from Eastern Kentucky. Jessica from Chicago, so glad you're here. One question I did have asked me, what quilts am I intending to make in 2021? Well, I'll be honest, my December 2020 did not go quite the way I thought, and I did not get the quilts finished that I wanted. So my January is really going to be filled with just getting those projects finished. And luckily, my Toronto Modern Guild, their UFO challenge ends at the January meeting, and our meeting is the last Sunday of the month. And that's my goal. My goal is to finish off those 20, and then the ones going forward, I don't have any commercial patterns that I am intending to make this year. I'm working on my own patterns. I've got a couple in mind. I've got the basis of a block of the month sew-along planned for later in the year. So if you're thinking of sew-alongs, just think maybe in September I'll have something. Somebody has asked, where am I actually located? I'm in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which is sitting on the Great Lakes and the north side of Lake Ontario. Right across the lake we have Niagara Falls, and a little bit farther beyond that we have Buffalo, New York, and Buffalo gets all the snow and we get all the ice. So that's where I am. Am I joining any sew-alongs this year? No, I'm not joining any sew-alongs this year. I'm trying to be very focused on my own projects this year. I've got a couple of irons in the fire, so to speak, and I'm really, really enjoying making Karen's Quilt Circle and the interviews, and that's just added some workload. So I'm just trying to stay focused on things that I enjoy, working on new projects. Somebody's asked me how many UFOs I have. My UFO list is pretty whittled down now. I think I have a difference between works in progress and UFOs, and I define the difference between the two. Our UFOs are projects that I haven't touched for like 3 to 4 months, or I've abandoned. I started them last year and I haven't done anything with them. So I probably have maybe 5 of those. I do have a lot of works in progress that I just sort of jump around and do things. So I probably have between 5 and 10 works in progress. I have a lot more kernels of ideas, those projects where I've pulled fabrics from my stash hoping to make something and then I never take it off. It never goes anywhere. I have it in a baggie. I may have it with some snippets of the idea of what I want it to do with it, but I've never gone anywhere with it. And those ones I can simply just unbag and put back in my stash. This is a good time of year for me to look through those. Am I going to actually do something with that, or is it time to put these away? Somebody's asked, they are making half square triangles into a full-size quilt and need to make a king size now. I don't have more fabric. What to do now? I don't actually understand what you're saying there. You've got half square triangles, but you don't have any more fabric? Like, are you looking for ideas of where the fabric can come from? Or are you looking at a way that you can change the shape of the HSTs so that you can make a king size quilt? Can you just explain that one a little bit more? Do I remove the paper from the 3-inch scrappy strip? So they're talking about, I have a project where I have 3-inch adding machine paper and I just sew my crumbs to them. So you'll see what we're talking about in my video, what to do with your crumbs. And yes, I definitely remove the paper, but by sewing the crumbs to the paper, it stabilizes it. So I can keep them in rectangles until I sew those long strips together, and then I can make, when I make them into a block, then I can rip out that paper. But it just keeps it stabilized, so you're not, it just doesn't go too wonky on me. I mean, I could easily make it without those papers, but by having the paper, I know what size I have to make, so I don't have that part in my, that thought always going around in my head. And 2, it just gives me finite amounts to make, which is really nice to have out of the decision process for me. So I'm just accumulating those and I'm going to do something with those. Do you have any issues when washing red fabric? I have a red, white, and blue quilt planned and I'm afraid of bleeding. Well, red is a fabric that does bleed often, and dark blues bleed often. It's just because of the amount of dye and the types of dye that they have to use to put them in. So if you have any issues, you should be washing them ahead of time, pre-washing them. There is a very good article by Vicki Welch, I believe is her name, and just Google Save My Bleeding Quilt. And she has a wonderful article on how, when your fabrics have bled, how do you clean them up? Very good, should be something that everybody has either pinned to their screen or printed out and has in a reference, because there's going to be a time in everyone's life when their quilt bleeds. Quilting fundamentals for the beginner quilt. I am a sewer and have traditional notions, but what should I start collecting for tools for quilting? Well, as a traditional sewer, you probably don't have the rotary cutter. You don't have those big straight edge rulers that you need. So I recommend for all beginner quilters, the one ruler that you need is the very long, I think it's 24 inches by 6 inches. Get that ruler first. It's not the most easy to use because of the length, but you definitely need the long ruler to be cutting those width of strip fabrics. And then you can just use it for the smaller ones. From there, it goes to what kind of quilt you're making. The second ruler you should buy is what goes to with what quilt you're actually making. So get the square ruler for the size of block that you're making in your quilt. So if you're making 6.5 inch squares, get a 6.5 inch ruler, because then you can just easily square them up. And if you're making 9.5 inch blocks, get the 9.5 inch ruler, etc. The triangle rulers and things like that, you don't need to purchase those until you actually start to make that type of quilt. And there's all sorts of different sizes of triangles, so don't worry about triangles. Truly, with sewists moving to quilting, the big thing is the 1/4 inch seam. and the ironing technique. Those are the two big things that are different. The seam allowance is so much smaller, and you have to be so much more accurate. So that's the big difference. The ironing, you're flipping everything to the one side, so you need to have a very good ironing technique. So I've got a video on both of those things. You'll probably have to invest in an extra feet and an extra sewing plate for your sewing machine. You want the single hole sewing plate, and you want those 1/4-inch feet for your sewing machine. So that's where I would start, and then you just let it grow with what kind of quilting you want to do. Because you may go more fiber artish, you may go more applique. So yeah, just let the style of quilting that you enjoy doing drive the rest of those tools. Oh boy, I've got lots of questions here. I have 7 or 8 tops that need quilting. Should I buy a roll of batting or just keep buying sizes needed? I would buy a roll of batting if you can afford it. For me, that made it so much easier for me. I could afford batting, a big roll of batting. So I just bought the one that I liked. It was 100% cotton. I kept it in the back of my cupboard, and I just roll it off. And like when you have 7 or 8 quilts to do at one time, I just roll it out on my bed, my king size bed, because that's the biggest flat surface in my home, and I just cut it. Just another point, where you're cutting those rolls of batting, it is a long line, and you want to keep that straight. So that's when I bring out that laser. I'm not at my home here, but that laser square that you've seen me use when I've squared up my quilts. And you just put it on the other side, and that just helps you cut that straight line across that big expanse of fabric. Yeah, so yes, I would definitely buy a roll if you can afford it. Any UFO challenges for 2021 planned? I don't have a UFO challenge planned, but I do have a decluttering challenge planned for this month. So not this week, but next week. So stay tuned, subscribe to my newsletter, and keep an eye out for the video. How is my son? My son is doing very well, thank you very much. Just launched a video, my 2020 in review. He is doing very well. And you know, we're just all, it's difficult in that we're all isolated, right? So he's no longer in my bubble. And so we don't get to have that same closeness that we've had this year, but he's doing well. He's doing well. Thank you all. And if you watch my video, you'll see that we raised over $1,400 for the North York General Foundation. Thank you. You mentioned a day job. Could you share briefly what spurred you to become a YouTube quilt sensation? Well, maybe I am. Okay, so my husband and I had a service business servicing major appliances, but between children, before and after, I worked with inventory. I was a purchaser, I was inventory analyst, and I took jobs cleaning up inventory. So that's why when I talk about decluttering and managing your UFOs and just that structure, I've got some experience behind me doing that. And I can be ruthless in certain areas of my life, and I can be very wishy-washy in others, but I know how to handle inventory. And the great thing is I've never had an unsatisfied customer. So I know parting with things is difficult, but you just have to forgive yourself and move on. But that's for next week's video. Do I have any tips for working with denim from recycled blue jeans? I plan to make a gardening quilt from my husband's old jeans. The most important thing when you're using quilting with denim is you need to have a very strong ruler. Okay, you should be probably at least at 100, 110, because you're going to be going through a lot of layers of fabric, and those layers of fabric need a strong needle to get through. And a denim needle also has a point that will help you get through those needle point, that thickness. A lot of gardening quilts are, I should say, a lot of denim quilts are often raw edged, and that's just to avoid all those layers of denim accumulating. But that's not an issue if you're using the right the right needle, but thickness is going to be an issue. So you don't really want to get too complicated. I would just stick to squares or rectangles. You can make a really nice like subway tile pattern with denim. You can also just do simple squares. I really wouldn't get into half square triangle blocks or anything more fancy, just because you're just going to be dealing with those intersections of denim where it's going to be hard to sew and it's just going to be really thick. So just keep it simple, and great idea for a garden quilt. How do you fix bias edge blocks when they do not lie flat once they're sewn together on your top? Okay, so that is one of the, I think I'm going to have to do a video on sewing with biased edges. Is the biggest challenge, well, one of the biggest challenges for quilters. And we think because we can cut it, we can sew it. And once you cut on a diagonal and you're cutting off grain, your fabric begins to release, those fibers begin to release, and you get those wobbling effects. It's not unique to quilters, but quilters want fabrics flat, where if you're making garments and you're making other things, you often take advantage of that bias. In quilting, I don't think we have any situations where we're really taking advantage of the bias. We're always trying to sustain it. Before, it's really important that you stabilize it. If you're working with a lot of, let me just give you a couple of pointers. When you're working with bias fabrics or bias cuts, try not to cut it until you need to use it, because the longer that it's cut and those edges are exposed, the more chances it's going to just release and get stretchy. 2, try and stabilize it. Use starch before you start, trying just to add a little bit of scaffolding there to help it. And make sure you're being accurate. So don't be pulling on it. Make sure, often when you're sewing 2 of them together, you just blindly sew and don't understand that this has to be 2 inches long and not 2.5 inches long. Just because your 2 points are together doesn't mean that you're going to get your accuracy. So after it's done, it is very hard to recover from. If your seams on the side are very wobbly, I would take them in. It's just simple as that. I've seen quilts where people have actually removed whole blocks. They've been so wonky just to get that, just to bring it back in. You might be able to gather it in, depending on how much it is. You could take a piece of bias tape or something, if we're just talking about an outside curve, and that's supposed to be the end of your block, you could do a very large stitch and then just sort of pull it in like you would do a gather on a skirt or something like that, and then sew it to a piece of bias tape. But in the end, the best thing to do is just tuck it in, or lose a point or 2. If you're a beginner quilter, this is just part of your journey. You just have to realize that your skills are just not at that level. But those are, in a Q&A, that's about, that's the verbal advice that I can give you without actually showing you on your own work. So good luck. Oh boy, we've got lots of questions here. Decided to use a free triangle template to use up a lot of scraps to make a finished quilt in the shape of a triangle. A bit quirky. How would you suggest quilting it? Style of quilting. Again, unless I see it face to face, it's not going to be something I can really give you a good idea on. Triangles, I have a tendency just to choose one corner as the point and then do a radiating design to the quilt, to the point. I don't think that one. This one is done by a pantograph, so I can't show you on that. But that's the normal way I do triangles, unless I'm doing an all-over design. So unless I can actually see your work, I can't give you a better idea than that. But try that. This is the clarification from the question at the beginning. Looking to increase the size of the quilt. I already made the half-square triangles into 10-inch squares and sewn them together. When I realized I needed to make the quilt bigger, I unpicked them back into the 10-inch squares. Should I add a border? Should I add fabric between all the squares? Not sure what to do next. I don't know how much farther you have to go. I mean, the easiest always is just to add a border on the outside edge, or several borders on the outside edge to make a quilt bigger. But sometimes those edges, it can just be like the border can be too big. So if you're getting into a situation when you're adding a border bigger than, I would say probably 8 inches, you might want to test it out on the bed to see how it looks. We look at quilts as flat things on a wall as people show them up, but it's best to look at your blocks and lay them out on a bed. So then you understand how much is overflowing on the sides and what to do there. But I would go, my personal taste is to, oh, geez. My personal taste is to put a border on. And I'm not really big on sashing, but if you like sashing and you think it looks good between the blocks, go for it. Like that's your taste. But those are traditional ways of making a quilt bigger. Add sashing, add a border. Is there a right way to use a seam ripper? Do you pick every stitch? There is a right way to use a stitch ripper, but the most important thing with a stitch ripper is to have a good one, because you can get cheap ones and they're not that sharp, and you end up just picking at them because you can't get any momentum going for them. But a stitch ripper, in the curve of the stitch ripper, there is a blade, and you should be able just to slice that through your fabric. Now that said, sometimes it slices through the fabric and not through the threads between the fabric, so you do have to be careful. But normally I hold the fabric with this hand, and I hold the stitch ripper and just get it on the right angle, and you can just slice through a lot of work very, very quickly. And practice. Practice. Just sew some scraps together and practice with your stitch ripper. And sorry, my husband is texting me. He's calling me on the phone and he's texting me, asking me to pick up bagels. Anyways, yeah, I use a Clover stitch ripper, but I have received other stitch rippers in goodie bags, and they've come with other things, and some of them you just throw them out. They are so poorly made. There's no blade on them whatsoever, and use the good stuff. It really makes a difference. Do I ever use a tailor's clapper for flattening seams? I do. I don't use them all the time. I have really worked hard on my ironing technique. I do not use steam. I just use a hot iron. Fabric relaxes. You know, you get that really nice crisp edge when you press, but you can come back to your fabric the next day and it will not have that nice crispness about it, because everything's just relaxed that little bit. So sometimes I do use a tailor's clapper when I'm looking for a really flat result in that moment. And it also depends on the fabric too. But I do have it there. I definitely use it when I'm using heavier fabrics, like a heavier cotton. I will use a tailor's clapper, but it takes more time. I mean, it really comes down to a time issue. To use a tailor's clapper, you have to leave it on the table for 10 to 30 seconds to actually have that work, and you also need to have steam for that to work. So I've had to spray it with water and that. So I don't use it that often in my quilting. For flattening seams, I just use a really good ironing technique, and it's amazing how much that works. Press, don't iron, don't squiggle, and you will be amazed at how good your results can be. When am I going to do part 2 of my sewing room renovation? That is next week. Next week it's coming, and it's on decluttering. That's the next part in the stage. Do I have a favorite quilt that I've made? Or is that like asking if you have a favorite child? It really is, and it's the moment. I've talked about this a lot. Quilts have stories attached to them. There's so much more in a quilt than just the fabric. You know, I've got my Victoria and Albert quilt here right from the very beginning. You know, I remember my friend Irene turning to me and saying, "Do you like this quilt? Do you want to do it together?" And we did it together. It came as a quick kit. We showed up at Stitch and Chat groups together and we made it. And then there was the whole process of making the after quilt to go with it. And then I long-armed it with my friend Susan at her house, and we had a wonderful weekend doing that. And you know, now it's been on my bed for a little while, and I've made a video about it. So even though maybe it's not my favorite colors or my favorite style, it's a favorite quilt because of everything else that's involved in it. You know, you rank up my Stash Buster quilts, and I was talking about this in my video that I released today. You know, you start off and you think, well, I kind of like this. But then, you know, once you handle it and you get to know those fabrics more intimately and like the little quirks that you see that the designer has done in the fabric, and the fact that like my Stash Buster 4, I have a picture of my eldest son lying underneath it. And now I look at that picture and realize he was actually quite sick at that time and we just didn't know it. You know, all these things get attached to your quilt. So truly it is, you can't choose a favorite. You can't choose a favorite because they've all got many stories attached to it. And I have a quilt right now that I didn't even make. My sewing sisters made for me. We're calling it our COVID quilts. We made one for each person in the group. We all worked on the blocks and gave them to one person who sewed them together, and we sent them off to Ginny, who long-armed them all. And then Leslie put the binding on them, and we gave them to each other. And that's a very special quilt, and I didn't even make it. So, yeah, you can't, I don't think you can choose favorites. I definitely think that you can choose, these are the ones that I don't like quite as much, but I don't think I've ever made a quilt where I was just happy for it to leave the building. There's just too much involved, too much friendship, too much color, yeah. And I enjoy quilting. You know, that's why I'm a quilter. I just got selected to be a quilt tester. Have you ever done this, and any suggestions? Yes, I was a quilt tester for my friend Laura Henberry. She did the circus tent quilt, and I was a quilt tester, pattern tester on that one. And I think the most important thing that you have is that the designer is looking for feedback. And all brains work differently. So the designer has a certain way that she thinks or he thinks, and you have the way that you think. So one of the important things that you can do is follow the directions, and if you have any difficulty with any of the parts, be very vocal about it, saying, I know I went back to Laura and said, you know, I was making this block and I found this point was the most important point in making the block. So make sure that you emphasize it. And she did. She went back and she just altered the pattern a bit, so there was focus on that one point. And the other thing they're looking for is for you to interpret it with your colors, right? They want to see that the pattern is robust and can work with a number of different tastes. So do it your way. Make sure all those little things that you do differently, you pass on to your pattern designer, because that's very important feedback that they need, and just don't be shy about it. How long have I been quilting? Did I hear you say 3 years? No, I've been quilting for, I guess officially 15, but I've been a lifelong sewer. I learned to sew when I was very young, and I realized that the first quilt that I made, I didn't. I helped my daughter make. She was in grade 4, and she had a 100-day project that she had to do, and they were studying pioneers. So we took some of my husband's old shirts and we cut them up, and we made a quilt out of 100 small squares. And I realized, you know, I probably did at least 50% of the work. So that's probably our first quilt. I took a quilting class. I think it was back in 2000. I think 2005 was when I took my quilting class. But I didn't really start passionately quilting until I joined a Stitch and Chat group with my cousin back in, I'm pretty sure it was 2013. I think it was 2013. Maybe it was 15. But I was quilting before that. I just was not quilting the same way. So I think I think my husband wants me to go home and pick up bagels on the way. I thank you very much for showing up today. I'm hoping this is a very good start to 2021. Thank you all for showing up from all over the world. I really appreciate it. And I hope you've enjoyed me answering your questions. And next time, I think I'm going to try and do a little bit of both. I'll have some prepared, and I'll just have Taylor feed me from the other side. Taylor is here helping me, not here physically, but she's at her location. She's been feeding me the questions, and I thank her very much for her help. We couldn't do it without her. If you don't follow me already, please follow me. You can find me on Instagram. You can find me on, well, you're here on Facebook, so you know that. And of course, my YouTube channel. I have a newsletter that goes out twice a month with a little bit of behind the scenes stuff. And on my website, that's where I'm trying to store all my, my free patterns that you can download and any other downloads that come. So check those out. And I do have a 2021 content survey. Just if you want to participate, you can go to my website. It's right there on the homepage. And I'm just looking for suggestions on videos that you would like me to make. So if you want your opinion known, please go fill out the survey today at www.justgetitdonequilts.com. Anyway, a new video went live. It's so funny. I took a couple of weeks off and I started to make this video, and it was like I never had made a video before. I just had to relearn how to do it all. I did watch a couple of my old episodes just to convince myself I still knew how to do it. And I look forward to a happy 2021. We won't be together physically, but I'm thinking of new ways for us to be together online. So take care, and I'll see you next time.